I was 19 at the time, working the night shift as a security guard at this office building in downtown Chicago. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid enough to keep gas in my beat-up Honda Civic and cover my part of the rent in the tiny apartment I shared with my buddy, Jake. The building itself was nothing special, a typical glass and steel structure with 10 floors, most of which were leased out to small law firms and tech startups. My post was in the lobby, where I sat behind a counter with a couple of monitors showing grainy security cam footage of empty hallways and parking lots. It was New Year's Eve, and the city outside was alive. Even through the thick lobby windows, I could hear the faint hum of honking cars, distant music, and people yelling, "Happy New Year." It was kind of depressing, to be honest. My friends were out at some rooftop bar, posting Instagram stories of their champagne glasses and fireworks, while I was stuck watching an empty building for 8 hours. Around 9 p.m., I noticed headlights flashing in the parking lot. 2 cars, a black Mercedes and a silver Toyota Camry, pulled in one after the other and screeched to a stop right outside the entrance. The drivers of both cars jumped out almost simultaneously, and I could hear them yelling even before the automatic doors slid open. The first guy was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with a sharp jawline and a tailored suit that screamed, "I'm important." The second guy was younger, maybe late 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, but the intensity in his voice matched the older guy's. They were pacing back and forth, phones glued to their ears, shouting something about the deal and the shipment. At first, I stayed put. It wasn't really my job to get involved, and honestly, they looked like the kind of people who'd tell you to mind your own business. But then I saw the younger guy slam his phone down onto the hood of his car, looking so frustrated that I figured something serious was going on. Against my better judgment, I got up and walked out into the cold. The air hit me like a slap, icy and sharp, with a faint smell of car exhaust and street food from the vendors down the block. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound casual but not intrusive. "Everything okay here?" The older guy turned to me, his face a mix of stress and suspicion. "Do you work here?" he asked, gesturing toward the building. "Yeah," I said, pointing at my security badge. "What's going on?" Turns out, they had a flat tire. Well, technically the younger guy did, but they were both clearly in a bind. The older guy explained that they were on their way to some big New Year's Eve charity gala, and this wasn't just any night, it was a night where they absolutely had to show up together. Something about investors and making a public appearance. Lucky for them, I wasn't just your average security guard. My dad had owned a small auto shop when I was growing up, and I'd spent enough summers there to know my way around a jack and a lug wrench. "I can help you out," I said, shrugging like it was no big deal. Both of them looked skeptical at first, but desperation has a way of making people trust strangers. "I'll stop here for now, let me know if you're hooked, and I'll continue with part 2. I grabbed the basic tool kit we kept in the building storage closet, nothing fancy, but enough to get the job done, and headed out to the lot. The younger guy, who introduced himself as Ryan, had already popped the trunk of his Camry, where a spare tire sat buried under a pile of gym clothes and random junk. He was pacing while scrolling through his phone, muttering something about missing the whole damn night. The older guy, whose name was Michael, leaned against the hood of the Mercedes, visibly impatient. The thing about situations like this is that they're never just about the flat tire. There's always a storm of emotions underneath, stress, frustration, and that helplessness people feel when something small derails their carefully laid plans. Ryan kept shaking his head like he was about to lose it, while Michael stood there, trying to play it cool but checking his watch every 30 seconds. "Relax," I said, crouching down to inspect the flat. "We'll get this sorted out in no time." It wasn't as easy as I made it sound. The lug nuts were practically fused to the wheel, and the freezing air wasn't helping. My hands were stiff, and I could feel the cold seeping through the thin material of my work jacket. But I kept working, determined to get them back on the road. As I struggled with the tire, Michael started talking, more to himself than to me, I think. He mentioned how the gala wasn't just some party but a major networking event for his business. He owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Midwest and was apparently sponsoring the event. Ryan, I learned, was one of his managers and had been promoted just a few months earlier. The way Michael spoke, you could tell he was used to getting what he wanted. But there was a hint of vulnerability, too, like this flat tire was more than an inconvenience. It was a crack in the image of control he tried so hard to maintain. Ryan, on the other hand, was pure frustration. "This is the worst timing," he muttered, kicking at the snow-dusted pavement. "I told you we should have left earlier." Michael shot him a look. "And I told you to get that tire checked weeks ago." The tension between them was palpable, but I tried to stay focused. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the spare on. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and gave the wheel a final tap. "You're good to go." Ryan let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. "Man, you just saved my life," he said, half joking but clearly relieved. Michael stepped forward, his expression softer now. "What's your name?" "Ethan," I replied. He nodded, studying me for a moment. "Well, Ethan, I owe you one. Big time." I laughed it off, saying it was no big deal, but he shook his head. "No, seriously. People don't help each other out like this anymore." Before I could respond, he pulled out his wallet and handed me a crisp $100 bill. I tried to refuse, it felt weird taking money for something so simple, but he insisted. "That's just for now," he said cryptically before sliding into his Mercedes. Ryan gave me a quick fist bump, and just like that, they were gone, taillights disappearing into the night. I went back inside, feeling strangely proud but also a little overwhelmed. I didn't know it then, but that night was about to change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Let me know if you're ready for part 3. It gets even crazier. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the two of them, the urgency in their voices, the tension between them, and, most of all, the way Michael had looked at me before he left. There was something about it, like he wasn't just saying, "Thanks," but making a silent promise. I shrugged it off. Rich guys like that probably forgot about people like me the second they pulled out of the parking lot. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was dead tired. I hopped into my Honda Civic, the engine rattling awake like it always did, and drove the 20 minutes back to my apartment. My place was nothing special, a cramped, two-bedroom walk-up with peeling paint and a bathroom door that didn't close all the way. Jake was passed out on the couch when I got in, a half-empty pizza box and some beer cans scattered around. He'd probably just gotten back from the New Year's party. "Dude," I muttered, kicking the empty cans out of the way as I collapsed onto the recliner. He groaned without opening his eyes. "You missed a good time, man." I didn't respond. I was too tired to explain why I'd spent my New Year's Eve changing someone else's tire in the freezing cold. A few days passed, and life went back to normal. Work, sleep, repeat. Then, on the following Friday, something insane happened. It was about 3 p.m., and I was getting ready for another night shift. My Civic was parked on the street outside the apartment, and I was halfway out the door when I noticed a black Range Rover pull up to the curb. At first, I didn't think much of it. This was Chicago, after all. Fancy cars weren't exactly rare. But then I saw Michael step out. He was wearing another one of those expensive suits, and his presence alone made the whole block feel different. He looked around for a moment before spotting me on the steps. "Ethan," he called out, smiling like we were old friends. I froze, completely caught off guard. Hey," I managed, walking down to meet him. "What are you doing here?" He held up a set of car keys. "Returning the favor." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Michael gestured to the Range Rover. "This. It's yours." I laughed, thinking it had to be some kind of joke, but he wasn't laughing. He handed me the keys, and for a second, I just stood there, speechless. "You're kidding, right?" I finally asked. "Nope," he said, leaning casually against the car. "I told you I owed you. And this is how I'm paying you back." I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing, and my mind was scrambling to process what was happening. "Why? I mean, you barely know me." He shrugged. "True. But I know enough. You didn't have to help us that night, but you did. And you didn't ask for anything in return. People like you are rare, Ethan. Consider this my way of saying thank you." Before I could argue, he clapped me on the shoulder and started walking back toward the curb. "You can sell it, keep it, whatever you want," he said over his shoulder. "Happy belated New Year." And just like that, he was gone. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the car. The thing was immaculate, jet black with leather seats and a dashboard that looked like something out of a spaceship. It was easily worth more than my entire apartment. When Jake came out a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and holding a mug of coffee, he nearly dropped it when he saw the Range Rover. "Dude, what the hell is this?" "It's mine, I guess," I said, still in disbelief. The next few weeks were like living in a dream. Everywhere I went, people stared. I was the 19-year-old kid with a car that screamed millionaire, and I'll admit, I loved the attention. Girls at the coffee shop who'd barely noticed me before suddenly wanted to talk, and even Jake started treating me like I was some kind of celebrity. But the reality of owning a car like that started to sink in pretty quickly. The insurance was ridiculous, gas was a nightmare, and every time I took it out, I felt like I was driving a ticking time bomb. One scratch, one fender bender, and I'd be in debt for years. I'll stop here for now. Part 4 is where things really get interesting. Let me know if you're ready for it. Owning the Range Rover felt like a dream at first, but it didn't take long for reality to hit me like a freight train. Don't get me wrong, I loved the car. Every time I slid into those leather seats and heard the engine purr, I felt like I was living a life way beyond my pay grade. But that feeling didn't come cheap. First off, gas prices were no joke. I was used to my Honda Civic, which could run forever on a tank of gas. The Range Rover? Not so much. Every trip to the pump was like a punch to the gut. And the insurance? Let's just say it was a number I didn't even want to say out loud. On top of that, I was constantly paranoid about something happening to it. I couldn't park it on the street like my Civic, I had to find garages or safer lots, which meant paying extra everywhere I went. At first, I tried to keep up with the costs. I picked up extra shifts, cut back on everything else, and even stopped going out with my friends. But no matter how hard I worked, it felt like I was just treading water. Then there was the attention. The car turned heads wherever I went, and yeah, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it at first. Suddenly, people who'd barely acknowledged me before wanted to know me. Girls at work who used to treat me like I was invisible started finding reasons to talk to me. Even Jake, who'd been my buddy since high school, started acting differently. "Man, you're living the dream," he'd say every time we went out in the car. But the truth was, I wasn't. The Range Rover was like this big, shiny symbol of a life I couldn't actually afford, and the longer I held onto it, the more it felt like it owned me, not the other way around. One night, about 3 months after Michael had given me the car, I was driving home from work. It was late, the streets were empty, and the city felt quiet in a way it rarely did. I remember sitting at a red light, looking at the dashboard, and feeling this wave of exhaustion wash over me. This isn't sustainable, I thought. That night, I made the decision. As much as I loved the Range Rover, it was time to let it go. The next morning, I listed it online. Within days, I had a buyer, a guy who owned a luxury rental business and wanted it for his fleet. The sale went through quickly, and when the money hit my account, I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness. I used part of the money to buy a used Toyota Corolla. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable, cheap to maintain, and got me where I needed to go. The rest of the money went into savings, my first real savings account, actually. Life got a lot simpler after that. The girls who'd been interested in me because of the car stopped calling, and Jake went back to treating me like the same broke roommate I'd always been. And honestly, I was okay with that. But every now and then, I think about that Range Rover. I think about the way it felt to drive it, the way people looked at me, and the way it came into my life so unexpectedly. Michael's generosity still blows my mind, even now. I never saw him or Ryan again, but I'll never forget what he said that night outside my apartment: "People like you are rare." I don't know if that's true, but I do know this: I'll always be grateful for that crazy, unforgettable chapter of my life.